Hey everybody, this is Robot here from Vespa Motorsport and ScooterWest.com. So for all your parts and accessories for your modern or vintage Vespa, check us out on the web, ScooterWest.com. So what am I going to cover today? You probably already know by the title. I'm going to show how to change either a master cylinder, which is the hydraulic piece that puts the pressure on your hydraulic disc brakes, or the lever perch, which is the part that acts on the brake cable for a mechanical brake. And this is pretty much universal across the entire Piaggio and Vespa range. Pretty much all the steps I'm going to show you cover all the models of Vespas and Piaggios. Of course, there's nuances between taking the handlebar covers apart. You have the smaller scooters that have a hydraulic front brake and a mechanical rear brake. You have the higher end scooters such as a Vespa GTS or an MP3 500. It's going to have hydraulic brakes for both the right side for the front brake and the rear brake, which would be on your left side. So those are the differences between them, but it's pretty much all the same steps. They're all bolt up the same. Also going to just show at the beginning of this video just how to change your levers, because 9 times out of 10 you don't need to replace these whole entire assemblies, but you need to replace the levers. So first of all, let me go into why you may want to change these out. On a hydraulic brake, they have rubber seals inside this piston. There's a piston and rubber seals in there. It might start leaking brake fluid, or maybe the scooter's been neglected for several years and it's got brake fluid that looks like mud in there. It usually will damage this master cylinder, or it may be unsafe. Like you pull the brakes and the lever just keeps on creeping in. Well, that's a very dangerous situation. Maybe you can't ever bleed it to get the air out of it. Maybe it causes the brakes to drag. It could be several of those symptoms are a good instance why you need to replace a master cylinder. They don't sell rebuild kits for these anymore. These are rather inexpensive. We carry nearly all the different master cylinders for the Vespa range, and many of them also for the Piaggio range of scooters. Different part numbers for all the different models. Even between years they've changed it. For instance, the Primavera and Sprint one looks identical to this, but there's some internal differences because those scooters have an ABS braking system. So I think the piston is actually a different size in there. Probably work if you use the old LX one, but good idea to get the correct part. And the best way to get the correct part is give the Scooter West team a call. We have 3 people on staff at ScooterWest.com to answer the phones and parts, and just give them the VIN number and they'll look up the correct parts. Alternatively, you could search for it on ScooterWest.com, kind of narrow it down to your year, make, and model, and figure out what application part will fit your scooter. Email us at sales@ScooterWest.com and the guys will look it up for you and get you a quote for the replacement parts. On the other end, for the mechanical brakes, which are always found on the left side for the rear brake of most 150 and smaller Vespas, with some exceptions. There's some 125s, 150s, even some 50s that have rear disc brakes. The mechanical cable, there's several variations of this as well. The mirror threads in here, oftentimes these are replaced because the mirror stem, like the mirror is broken off and it broke a piece of the mirror off and it's rusted in there. You could certainly try to put a insert in here, but this thing doesn't cost hardly anything. It isn't that hard to change out. So just buy the whole part and you get, as an extra bonus, you get an extra lever if your other lever is still good. All assembled, ready to go. Again, several different variations of this part. Make sure you get the correct one. So if you're just going to change out the levers, you just need enough tools to dismantle the handlebar covers. I don't show the Torx driver, which is a star style bit, a T25 Torx driver for many of the newer Vespas, but you'll need a Phillips screwdriver. You're going to need a big flat screwdriver, and that's what you need to take the screws out of the lever pivot pins. A 10mm combination wrench. It's also useful sometimes to have a little vice grip or pliers. And if you're changing out the levers, highly recommend that you have grease on hand. Anytime you do service, it's a good idea to have a good quality grease. A lot easier than using the grease gun tubes that you use typically on an automobile for greasing the chassis of a car or truck. We sell this in the tub, and it's nice and thick, perfect for using on the scooters. Part number grease on scooterwest.com, made by Maxima, which is here in San Diego County. If you're going to move on to changing the whole perch, I recommend having a whole set of combination wrenches. I end up using a 14 and a 17 millimeter. Assortment of Allen keys. I specifically used a 4 millimeter and a 6 millimeter. A set of just needle nose, that was helpful. A pry tool or a spudger tool. We sell a whole set of these on the Scooter West web store. Really inexpensive. They're pretty handy to have when prying some of the plastic pieces off these scooters. Another item, if you're changing out the left side lever perch, you need to remove your grip. And when you put a new grip on, you need to glue it on. I recommend having a grip glue on hand. And at scooterwest.com, we have part number grip glue, which is a single-use tube. So if you're changing out a hydraulic master cylinder, there's 2 additional things that you're going to need to have on hand. Recommend replacing the crush washers for the banjo bolt. You never want to reuse these. Part number on these is 127927. You're going to need a pair of them for each master cylinder. Also going to need .4 brake fluid. We have both the Brembo brand and the EBC brand brake fluid on our web store, scooterwest.com. Perfect size for completely flushing the brake system on any Vespa or Piaggio system, and completely meets the specifications needed for these Vespa and Piaggio scooters. And in order to successfully drain and flush the brake fluid, I recommend having a brake bleeder. There's several different tools out there on the market for flushing brakes. We, in our workshop, use some pretty high-end vacuum bleeders. If you're just doing this at home for one time, I just recommend buying a syringe, a big 60 milliliter syringe. And we have those on our web store, tool syringe. And again, I talked about a lot of products needed and some of the parts needed, the change out levers or the whole master cylinder. I'm gonna leave some of these part numbers in the description of this video. So feel free to look in the description of this video and you'll see the part numbers for the various items needed. So your first step is you need to dismantle the handlebar covers on your Vespa. So whether you have a Vespa S150 or Vespa S50 like this with a square headlight, or the LX150 with a round headlight, pretty much the same steps. If you have a Primavera or Sprint, 2015 and newer Vespa, it's going to be a couple different steps on the fastener locations. And I suggest you look at some of my other videos on how to dismantle the handlebars on a Vespa Sprint or Primavera, so you get some tips on where the fasteners are for that model. But once you get the plastics off, it's pretty much the same across all these Vespas, all the way back to the Vespa ET series from 1996 to the current Vespas. Pretty much get the plastics out of the way. The master cylinder and the lever perch for your left side mechanical brake has been pretty much the same for nearly 30 years on these modern Vespas. So for the next couple minutes, I'm going to show how just to change the levers. So oftentimes you have a fall, you may break or bend the lever. It will look like a little curly cue. It's kind of annoying to use. For whatever reason, if you just need to change the lever, you can watch the next couple minutes on how to do that. If you're going to change the whole entire lever perch or the master cylinder, you can just skip past the next couple minutes and just go on to the more difficult part where you're pulling these parts off the thing. So to change out the levers, if you have a GTS, which have hydraulic master cylinders on both sides, or any of the smaller models that only have hydraulic front brakes, so on the right side, take a 10 millimeter open end wrench, combination wrench, loosen that nut that's underneath the lever, and then go ahead and remove this large step screw right here. And I'm holding the nut because that's a locking nut to keep this screw from coming loose. And at this point, screws all the way loose, and go ahead and separate the nut right here. So pull that step screw out, you can set it aside, and have your hand underneath the lever, because oftentimes you're gonna have these two washers drop out. Take a dab of grease, put it on each side of these wells. You know, obviously on a perfect lever, a new lever. This scooter is perfect in every way, so I don't need to change the lever, so I'm just putting them back on. A little bit of grease, and just set those washers back into these little wells on here. And one thing, if you're using aftermarket levers, you may need to file the powder coat if they're like black levers, so these washers sit in there. It's pretty important to have these washers. Levers will last a lot longer. They won't vibrate around with these steel washers in place. The last thing is put a little grease on this heel here. This is the pivot point where it presses on the plunger for the master cylinder. So with the washers in place, go ahead and slide the lever back into your right master cylinder. If you have a Vespa GTS model, it could be the left as well, exact same lever. 497042, I think is the lever. Look in the description, I have all the part numbers for all these levers, and that's universal across nearly all the Vespas, with the exception to the ET series and the 946. They pretty much all use that same lever for hydraulic brakes. So go ahead and thread the screw all the way in until it stops. And at this point, you could tip that throttle cable out of the way, thread the nut on by hand, and get your wrench under there. And just give it a little snug. Now the lever feels really nice with fresh grease in there as well. So let's go on to the more difficult lever to change on the left side, where the mechanical brake, where you have a mechanical cable going into it. So on any of the 125, 150, or even 50cc engines, located on the left side, just under the very end of the engine, or the very rearmost end of the engine, is the mechanical adjustment for your rear brake. So first of all, you got to get a 10mm wrench and loosen the lock nut. There's a lock nut on this, and it's on the inside of this cable. It's threaded. And go ahead and just loosen that piece. Thread it out several turns. Just go in there, keep on threading it out. So if the whole cable's turning, there's this little 8mm nut at the frontmost part of this cable. You can use a combination 8mm wrench or something like this, like a vice grip, just to hold it. So that just holds the cable while I take this off here. And if you have a large socket on there, like a deep socket, that makes the job even easier. I just right now have a wrench, so kind of, and you want to take that all the way off. Like I said, this bike's pretty clean. This scooter's nice and clean, not much rust. If there's a lot of rust on all these parts, it's gonna be pretty difficult. Maybe a perfect time just to change out the whole cable. The replacement rear brake cables are rather inexpensive. The other thing to keep in mind is watch out that you don't lose that piece right there. We're gonna go ahead and get that out of the way. So now we can move back up to the lever. So just like the right lever on the hydraulic disc brake side, the mechanical side, you'll use a 10mm combination wrench and a flat screwdriver. So there's a lock nut underneath. Loosen that, then go ahead and remove the screw. And once the nut drops away, go ahead and continue to remove the screw until it's no longer unthreading. And just move the lever a little bit and you'll be able to pull the screw out. You know, sometimes there's a little resistance because there's spring tension of the rear brake cable on this lever here. So at this point, have your hand ready to catch a spring that's going to fall out. I'm going to go ahead and pull the lever off, and you're going to have a spring that falls out like that. The next step is you want to pull the lever away from the master cylinder and then pull the cable, and you can see it springs back. There's an internal spring in the cable, and then go ahead and shift the cable until you're located at the slot, and go ahead and lever the cable out. And also, if you have a problem with your brake switches, like the scooter's not starting, both the left and the right side, they have these thread-in switches. You can disconnect the connection, unthread the switch. Inexpensive switches if you do need to change those out. So part number for the mechanical rear brake cable style lever is 564683 is this style lever. And we have those available on Scooter West. Sometimes we have other combinations such as dog leg shorter levers and adjustable levers. If you have the hydraulic brake setup on both sides, like on a Vespa GTS, there's a lot more lever options available for you. So go ahead and fill this little well with grease and go ahead and drop that spring in there. Now with the grease, the spring's not going to want to pull out. And I also recommend putting a small amount of grease on this top section here, and you can even put a little grease where the cable will drop into. So with the cable out, go ahead and line up the barrel with the slot. Sometimes you got to pull the cable out. If it's really, really tight, you could certainly use some needle nose, but go ahead and pull the cable out and get the barrel in there. At this point, flip the lever around and grasp the cable with one hand and the lever, and go ahead and pull them away. And as what we're going to do is go ahead and slot the lever in, make sure that spring goes back in place, and then slot the brake cable back in place. And it's a small amount of grease on the screw. It helps the pivot work a little bit better and be a little smoother. Then drop the screw in there. Take your flat screwdriver and thread the nut on the bottom side of that screw. Get your combination wrench, go ahead and tighten that down. And pretty much any of these pieces that you see inside the handlebars of any modern Vespa, we have them all in stock at scooterwest.com. Whether you're looking for new grips, the lever perches, replacement levers, the control cables, the brake switches, a complete speedometer, the hydraulic brake hose, handlebars, any of those parts, we're going to have them in stock. All the switches, those are a common item to replace. So just search for your make and model on the Scooter West website, and you'll find all the pieces if you do some searches and look at the exploded diagrams for your particular model. So during the next 10 to 15 minutes of video coverage, I'm going to show how to remove this lever perch and the master cylinder on pretty much any modern Vespa. At the very end, I'm going to show how to reconnect the mechanical brake cable. I didn't do that even though we just changed the lever on this. Kind of save it for the last, because anytime you remove this, you're going to have to dismantle the rear brake cable. So let's jump right into it. So first of all, we want to remove the rear half of the handlebar covers. If you have a Primavera or Sprint, you're going to want to remove those two little ends. You can't really remove the bottom half of the handlebar covers unless you pull the handlebars off, but it is possible to change both these pieces on a Sprint or a Primavera with just only the top half plastic removed. Vespa LXs, ET4s, S150s such as this model, the clamshell for the plastic handlebars separates from front to back. Any of the newer ones, it's top to bottom, for the Primaveras and Sprints. So the first one we're going to change out is this left side mechanical brake perch. This is a lever perch, and not only is it function for holding the brake lever, it also has a brake switch, and most importantly, the post for threading a mirror in. Oftentimes you may have broken off a mirror stud. This is the reason you need to replace this whole entire perch. Maybe you broke the lever in such a way that also damaged the body of this. That's also a reason where you need to change it. But the one tricky part about reordering a lever perch, there's 4 different part numbers depending on what year your model is. So if you have a Vespa ET2 or ET4, there's one style. I don't have it here. If you have a 2010 and older Vespa LX 50, 150, S150 such as this model, you'll need the CM063804. Pretty much the newer LXs and early Sprints and Primaveras, you know, so 2011 to about 2017, something like that. You're going to be using the CM063806. And if you have anything that's like pretty much 2018 newer, CM063809. So several different part numbers. You can see they're all very similar part numbers, but they've been going up just one digit because they made revisions that are unique to these different models. So keep that in mind. Don't just order the first one you see on scooterwest.com. Definitely recommend getting the correct one for your year. Of course, you can inquire to any of the parts team at scooterwest.com, give them your VIN number, and they'll be able to get you on track to get the exact piece that you need. So the first step is you're going to need to get the grip off. If you're going to replace the grips or don't have any problem replacing them, you could certainly cut the grip off. That's definitely the easiest way. If you want to salvage the grip, I recommend using compressed air. And the idea here is to get compressed air between the grip and the handlebars. And you can see it inflates like a balloon. You can see the pig snot style adhesive. It kind of will just roll right off with a little bit of pressure. Pulling off, you're probably not likely going to be able to easily pull that off. And at this point, go ahead and roll all the adhesive off here. If it's really dry and nasty, you may use some type of solvent or even sandpaper to sand it off. But just with my bare hands, I'm able to roll this adhesive off. But this grip, we could totally reuse this, still in really nice shape. We'll glue that back on when we're all done. So as you can see, there's two different connections on this lever perch. You got the brake switch. I'll use a nail or a small screwdriver. Go ahead and pull the connection. Sometimes I have individual connections. While it's on here, you can unthread the brake switch. If it's still good, you could use it on your new replacement lever perch. So unthread it from that perch. The brake switch is defective or just corroded, I just recommend replacing it. Next, you want to disconnect the mechanical cable here. So go ahead and pull the lever in. Remember, I have it disconnected down at the bottom, and that was the earlier step. And go ahead and pull you can leave the lever open like that, and then you're able to disengage the cable. At this point, it's just the lever perch on the handlebars. 5mm Allen key. Go ahead and remove this single screw here, or the Allen screw, and I'll show you what's underneath it. And there's usually quite a bit of friction when you're removing it. So I just recommend taking it all the way out. And you give it a little wiggle there. You can use either a magnet or some type of pick and pull this little ferrule out. So there's a little ferrule in there that will pull right out. And at that point, you're pretty much, you can see it's all loose right here. And you could pull the lever perch all the way off the tube. And the more adhesive that you have on here, the more difficult it's going to be to pull off. And you're wondering, how is this thing keyed so it knows where to stop? If you look at this bottom part, there's a little groove in there. And on the bottom of the handlebars, I don't really see it with the camera, there's a little pin or a peg. So that lines up in there. So you'll kind of feel it, and it will just engage right in that little key there. So once you have your new lever perch, which always includes a brand new lever as well, which is a nice added plus considering how cheap they are and expensive they are. You got a fresh lever as well. Go ahead and thread it. I'll try that again. Go ahead and slide it back onto your handlebars. And sometimes you have a little bit of friction. And right there you can see it's just keyed right where it needs to go. Then take your screw, put that ferrule on there, and make sure you don't cross thread this. It's really easy to cross thread this thing. And we'll go ahead and thread that Allen screw with that ferrule back in place here. And make sure you have it pretty tight. If it's heavily damaged, you may need to make some minor adjustments. The nice thing is when you have the handlebar covers all on, if this isn't perfectly centered, you can put an Allen key down the hole where the mirror thread's in and get access to that screw. Or if this perch is loose, you can always tighten it later. But it's pretty important you have it pretty tight, and that's pretty much how you change that lever perch. So in order to find the grip glue on Scooter West, just search the word grip glue, and we have small tubes, like single-use tubes, or you can use them a few times. I think they're a little generous to size. And have one of those on hand. But first of all, you want to clean this up. You can see this tube cleaned up really nice with just a little bit of solvent. I use some carburetor cleaner, brake cleaner, acetone, any type of solvent would do the trick. And also make sure that the inside of your grip is really clean as well. And just put a little bead of this grip glue inside the grip. You can see that's about what I've used. You don't need that much. You can put a little bit on here. If you get too crazy with the grip glue, it kind of tends to ooze out and make a big mess. Sometimes the grips are a little oriented, or how you want to position them. Just kind of put the nicest side up, typically. And at this point, just go ahead and push it on, and just right up to the edge, and that's where the grip needs to go on a Primavera or Sprint. If you have one with the hydraulic brakes, like a GTS, I would recommend putting a grip on after you have the plastics all back installed, so you know where this edge will stop. So just like the lever perch, for the master cylinders, there's several different part numbers for the Vespa and Piaggio range. For the majority of Vespa LXs and LX50, S150, part number 56216R is the correct Piaggio part number for the replacement master cylinder. If you have a Primavera or Sprint, it's going to be a CM074907, if I recall. I don't remember the GTS ones in the back of my head, but there's actually a specific one for the left side and the right side for Vespa GTS, because they're kind of a mirror of each other. If you have the Vespa GTV, they also have the silver, not chrome plated, but like a silver finish master cylinder. Same functionality, but they're in silver finish, and that's a different part number for the left and right as well. ET4, that uses a different one because it's got a different style lever. For the most part, they're all pretty universal. They made changes slightly internally in how they fit, but I do recommend giving the Scooter West team your VIN number so they can look up the specific correct master cylinder for your application. Alternatively, you can search for it on scooterwest.com by the year, make, and model, and kind of narrow down the specific one you need. Nice thing is we always have these in stock. As these scooters get older, that's the reasons where you need to replace a master cylinder. Maybe the brake fluid is deteriorated and eaten up the seals in there. They are not rebuildable. Some master cylinders are rebuildable, but they're inexpensive, so you just replace the whole thing in the interest of safety. Don't really want to mess around with your brakes. This one still feels good, but I'm just going to go through the exercise of removing it and putting it back on and quickly bleed the brakes. So the first step is you're going to need to get the throttle assembly out of the way, and that's not part of the master cylinder. So I have a 4mm Allen key, and typically they have a cap. Older models may have a single cable for the throttle. Nearly all the new stuff has double cable. So remove half the clamshell for the throttle pulley. You know, in here is the throttle pulley. And oftentimes you'll realize you can't really pull this all the way off. Sometimes you can. Let's see if we can do that. You know, just barely will reach. And if that's the case, I recommend disconnecting the cables from the carburetor, and then you could pretty much undo this cable. This one just locks right in like this. You know, you turn it 90 degrees and it will pop right out once the cable's loose, and then you're able to do it. But sometimes there's enough slack where you could just get it right off the grip end. So if it doesn't come off like that, you're going to need to disconnect the cables from the throttle body or the carburetor. But just enough slack with this one so we could pull that off, and you could just leave it hanging there. So just like the left side, they have a brake switch that triggers your brake light and also enables the scooter to start. Disconnect the connector. The brake switch isn't included with the new master cylinder. I would recommend going in here and sucking all the fluid out of the master cylinder so it doesn't make a mess. You can use a small syringe, or I'm going to use a vacuum bleeder just to suck the fluid out of the old master cylinder. And maybe it's just been a poor neglected scooter. May not be any fluid in there, maybe just all evaporated away. So make sure it's clean all the way around if you are, you know, for instance, I'm reusing this master cylinder. Not much fluid in there. That also may be an indication that your brakes are worn. I'm going to use a suction to remove all the fluid. Makes it much easier. You can, like I said, a syringe will do the trick, or you can just sop it up with a paper towel. It's just, if you get all the fluid out of the way, you're less likely to have drippage of the brake fluid. It's still going to inevitably drip out a little bit. So have a rag underneath this banjo bolt. Go ahead and break the banjo bolt free with, I use a 14mm combination wrench. And at this point, just unthread the banjo bolt. You'd be doing this if you had to change the brake cable, or even if you had to remove the whole front fork to change out the fender. And I've covered that in the past videos. Pretty much the same across the board for all these modern Vespas. So go ahead and pull that off. And these washers, I highly recommend replacing them and not reusing them. Banjo bolt's not going to be included with the replacement master cylinder. And sometimes just to keep the leakage down, the new master cylinders usually have a plug in the end, but you can put a little piece of paper towel in there. Just make sure you remove it if you're going to reuse the master cylinder, but it will just catch any drips. Because you get one drip on your paint work, it's not going to be all that good for your paint. It might even etch the paint. So there's a cap that holds the master cylinder to the handlebars. 4mm Allen key will do the trick, and just go between the two screws. And I recommend having them pretty far away. And you're wondering, how does this key itself to the handlebars? You can see right here, there's a little hole. If the scooter was in a severe crash, it oftentimes will break that peg on the master cylinder. The master cylinder is probably still usable if that peg is broken, but just keep that in mind. At this point, you'd slide the new master cylinder right back on, loosen these caps. One thing to keep in mind, if you remove these caps, it does say up, so make sure that's oriented in the correct direction. So go ahead and slide that in place. You can see it kind of engages with that hole. The aluminum peg on the master cylinder engages with the hole on the handlebars. So first of all, you want to tighten the top one. Just snug it, just like that, and then move on to your lower screw. And go between the two. And there's a specific torque, I think it's about 7 foot-pounds. But you start with the top closed up, and then you give the bottom one the last tightening there. So, and I don't want to touch the lever. If there is any fluid in it, it may leak out. I'm going to have a pair of new crush washers. So your brand new crush washer, go ahead and drop that onto the banjo bolt. And just remember the orientation, how this cable was oriented when you took it off. May take a photo. Go ahead and pull the plug out. And I'll just show you one thing I'm going to do before I tighten this all the way down. So it's kind of oftentimes just the natural position of the hose is all you need to do. I'm going to go ahead and just a little bit, not all the way, just a little bit. And I have fresh brake fluid here. So I'm going to go ahead and fill the reservoir maybe about halfway up. And the brand new brake cylinders, they are bled from the factory, so there is some fluid in them. That's why they have the little rubber plugs. The next step is you want to have a towel handy, and just go ahead and crack it just a little bit, and it's going to ooze out of the banjo bolt, and that's normal. So go ahead and pull the lever all the way to the handlebars and just tighten that a little bit more. Let the lever out, and one more time. It's just a small amount of fluid. I'm going to pull the lever as I crack this free here. So you can hear little air bubbles dribbling out, and the rag is catching the brake fluid. And then go ahead and tighten it up and let the lever out. I know it's a little tricky of an operation, but this will make bleeding the brakes so much easier if you get the air out of that banjo bolt. So at this point, go ahead and tighten the banjo bolt. And you do not want to over tighten these. They need to be pretty tight because you don't want them coming loose, but you do not want to over tighten that. But you know, just with a hand wrench, just give it a good snug. That's about all you need to do. You don't want to be at the end of the wrench and really crank on it. Reason being, it's a hollow bolt and they can easily break. Go ahead and thread the brake switch back in, get that out of the way. And you don't need any tools to do that. Plug the little brake switch in. You can see what I'm doing. There we go. So, and also be careful with the reservoir full. So I'm going to tip the handlebars so the master cylinder is kind of pointing up. And I'm going to give it a couple little wiggles. And oftentimes you'll see some bubbles pop up. I'm watching some little bubbles pop up. You might be able to see it in the camera. Just little, just like that. Check this out. Look at the lever has full pressure. I didn't allow the tube to drain any fluid out, but it was a nice, easy swap. And I would recommend flushing some fluid through the lines as well. You can open the bleeder at the master cylinder to do that. I've covered in past videos how to bleed brakes, but that's pretty much all you got to do. Change out a master cylinder if you're very careful. It gets all the bubbles out, and depending on the condition of your brakes, if your brakes are worn, you may not want to fill your reservoir all the way up. I recommend filling up until your sight glass pretty much doesn't show any air bubbles, just about like that. And go ahead and put the cap on. And if that was a brand new master cylinder, of course you need to dismantle the new master cylinder, put the pair of screws in there, and put it back together. And that pretty much is pretty close to how it sums up how to change out the master cylinder. If it's Vespa GTS, of course, pretty much same steps for the left or right, front or rear brake. So go ahead and just stretch the throttle assembly. And like I said, just barely reaches. And make sure the cables are all routed correctly. You know, it has the clamshell, but they don't have anything to orient the cable. So what I do is I would recommend partly putting this together. Have your 4mm Allen handy. And oftentimes on the handlebars you can kind of see where this was originally positioned. Get the cables where they're not really rubbing on the lever perch or the master cylinder. And just like when you removed them, go ahead and tighten them back down. Don't need to be all that tight. Make sure the throttle feels good and returns. All right, so we'll go ahead and assemble the handlebars. Make sure you get the connectors oriented correctly. They're all gonna look a little different depending on your model. And I'm just gonna snap everything in place. And I recommend having the key. Make sure everything functions on the scooter, including it starts and all that. Turn signals are working. High beam, low beam, all the dashboard indicators. So the last thing you want to do is put all the screws, put the mirrors on, and realize there's something loose or some problem. Sometimes you got to wiggle one of the connections. Now let's see what Phil over at Cleveland Vespa is texting me. Oh, okay. He knows I have a Honda CB1. Oh, that's kind of a cool fairing. All right, let's get back with the project here. So you can see how the lever perch, I have it a little bit too far rolled back. You can get an Allen key down in there and loosen that the pinch bolt on these, and then roll the lever down. So go ahead and loosen that pinch bolt. And at this point, see, we could shift the whole lever perch down just a little bit. You know, there's a little bit of give in there, and oftentimes you do have to make little adjustments to this. And once you get in the right spot, you can go ahead and tighten that back down. So a little tight, but you can make adjustments right through there. On the master cylinder, nope, you got to take the handlebars all the way off if there's some reason you need to make an adjustment. So, all right, so we have the cables already threaded through this little barrel right here. The lock nuts backed way out. We have our adjuster nut right here. It's a very unique nut. You can get this as a spare part if needed. Put a little grease on the ends. And go ahead and start threading it onto the shaft. And see how I'm moving that arm? You can just hold the arm where there's some pressure on it. Keep on threading that on. The grease makes it a lot easier to thread onto the threaded section of the brake cable. Versus using a wrench on it. And if you notice, it's kind of notched. Make sure the tire turns. Then go up, let's check our adjustment, see how I have it. So there's my adjustment. I would say that's just a tad too tight. I'm gonna back it out probably a half turn or 1 turn. You definitely don't wanna have this too tight. As the scooter warms up, sometimes the brakes will expand, and you'll end up with a dragging rear brake. So I'm just doing that by touch. So went ahead and backed that off, and we'll double check it one more time up here. That's much better. See how it moves about 1.5 inches. Another thing is you get a lever feel that's similar between the two. Maybe you have shorter hands, you can actually add more free play, but you want to make sure that you could do full braking without the lever touching the grip. That's also very important as well. So a little bit of a personal preference, and also if you have it too tight or too loose, that's also could be a problem. So go ahead and tighten the lock nut once you have it in a position you're happy with. Typically, if a shop services a scooter, they should be making this brake adjustment every time the scooter comes in for a service. And it's pretty important to have this lock nut in place just to keep things from backing out or doing anything weird. So there you have it. It's all tightened up, all put back together. Pretty much every step you need to do to change a lever, change a rear brake cable, left side lever perch, right side master cylinder, left side master cylinder on a GTS, dismantling the handlebar covers, and so on. I hope you found that interesting. If you made it through the whole video, thanks again for watching. Again, you wonder how you can support this channel. We don't monetize our videos. Consider buying your parts, accessories, and Vespa related products from our website, scooterwest.com. If you're in the Southern California region, feel free to check out our dealership, vespamotorsport.com. I run the successful service section of Vespa Motorsport. We're a very successful dealership that sells highly accessorized Vespas to people in all of Southern California and even in Mexico. Thanks again for watching. This is Robot here. Until next time, ride safe.